At first, when a woman pulls away or chooses distance, her mind is usually settled. She believes she understands the situation. She has a story that makes sense to her. She feels in control of her decision emotionally and mentally. There is certainty. Certainty creates calm. Certainty allows her to move forward without looking back. But something shifts when your energy disappears in a grounded, non-reactive way. Not dramatic silence, not cold punishment, not strategic manipulation, just quiet, stable absence paired with visible forward movement. That is when certainty begins to crack and curiosity begins to rise. Curiosity is the doorway back. Curiosity starts as a subtle disturbance, a thought that interrupts her routine, a question that doesn't have an answer. What is he doing now? Why hasn't he reached out? Why does he seem unaffected? This is not obsession at first. It is a soft mental tug, but that tug grows when it isn't resolved. When you were available, predictable, emotionally open, her mind could categorize you. She knew where you stood. She knew your patterns. She knew your emotional position. Familiarity created comfort, but it also created certainty. And certainty kills emotional tension. When you remove that certainty, the emotional system looks for resolution. Curiosity is the mind trying to restore balance. The more stable and self-directed you become, the more her mind starts to fill in the blanks. Silence forces imagination. Imagination is far more powerful than reality. It creates stories. It creates projections. It creates emotional contrast. Now, instead of knowing where you are emotionally, she feels the absence of knowing. That absence creates a vacuum, and the mind hates a vacuum. So it starts asking questions, not logical questions, emotional ones. Did I misjudge him? Did he move on faster than I thought? Is he becoming someone I might lose permanently? Was he stronger than I gave him credit for? Why do I suddenly feel him in my thoughts when he's not here? This is where the power shift begins, because curiosity is a sign that the emotional chapter is no longer closed. The mind reopens what it thought was finished. The emotional memory becomes active again, not through your effort, but through your absence. Curiosity grows when there is contrast between expectation and reality. She expected you to chase. She expected emotional reaction. She expected explanation. She expected visible longing. But what she feels instead is calm distance and quiet strength. That difference creates cognitive dissonance. The mind says, if he cared, he would reach out. But the nervous system feels something about his silence feels grounded, not weak. That contradiction creates emotional tension. And emotional tension is what pulls attention back. Now, curiosity becomes layered. It's not just, what is he doing? It becomes, who is he becoming? Growth creates mystery. Stability creates intrigue. Emotional independence creates a sense of depth that wasn't felt before. You are no longer a known quantity. You are an unanswered question. And unanswered questions occupy the mind. The more you focus on your life, your mission, your body, your discipline, your direction, the more your energy shifts from attachment to presence. Presence without need is powerful. It communicates that your center is within yourself. That is what curiosity is really responding to, a shift in center. When your center was on her, she felt the weight of being the emotional focus. That can feel heavy. When your center returns to yourself, the dynamic changes. The polarity changes, the emotional gravity changes. She no longer feels pursued. She feels the space where you once were. And the space starts to echo. That echo becomes memory. Memory becomes comparison. Comparison becomes questioning. Curiosity is the first sign that the emotional door is no longer sealed. It means your absence is now being processed, not ignored. It means your silence is being felt, not dismissed. It means your energy is being sensed, not forgotten. This does not mean immediate return. It means the internal narrative has shifted from I am done to I am thinking. And thinking leads to feeling. Feeling leads to emotional reopening. Curiosity is the beginning of emotional re-engagement even before contact. Not because you tried to pull her back, but because you stopped trying to hold her. And in that letting go, your presence became a question instead of an answer. That is when the shift begins. There is a strange psychological effect that happens when someone is no longer there. While presence can be comforting, absence has a way of amplifying emotion. When you were around, when you were available, when your attention and energy were consistent, your value was experienced in real time. It was familiar, and familiarity over time can become invisible. But when that presence is removed in a calm, grounded way, the emotional system suddenly becomes aware of the space that has opened, and that space is not empty. It is filled with memory, comparison, and the feeling of something missing. At first, she may feel relief, freedom, a sense of control. The mind says, "This is better. This is what I wanted." But the nervous system does not always agree with the mind, because the nervous system remembers emotional safety, emotional intensity, emotional connection. And when that connection disappears, it registers as a loss, even if the decision felt right at the time. This is when absence begins to grow heavier than presence ever was. When you were there, your value was part of her emotional environment. It blended into her daily life. But when you are gone, your value becomes contrast, and contrast is what the brain notices. She begins to feel the difference between how it was and how it is now. The way conversations used to flow, the way support used to feel, the way being understood felt, the way your energy filled a space. All of that becomes more noticeable in silence than it ever was in closeness. Silence acts like a mirror. It reflects back what is no longer there. And the mind, trying to make sense of the emotional gap, starts replaying moments, not the conflicts, not the reasons for distance, but the emotional highs, the connection, the feeling of being seen, the feeling of familiarity and comfort. This is not nostalgia by choice. It is nostalgia by contrast. When the present feels emotionally neutral, the past gains color. Your absence creates emotional weight because it forces comparison between with you and without you. And if you are handling your life with stability, growth, and composure, the contrast becomes even stronger. You are no longer the man who is emotionally available and centered on her. You are now the man who is centered on himself and no longer accessible. That shift changes the emotional memory. Now she is not comparing you to who you were when things ended. She is comparing you to who she imagines you are becoming. And imagination often elevates what is no longer available. The mind fills in the blanks in a favorable way when there is no new negative input, no arguments, no tension, no emotional friction, only silence and memory. And in that space, your presence becomes heavier because it is no longer mixed with daily imperfections. It becomes distilled into feeling. This is why absence can feel more powerful than presence, because presence includes reality. Absence allows projection. Projection often idealizes, not unrealistically, but emotionally. She starts to feel the weight of what your presence provided: stability, attention, connection, grounding, or even challenge. Whatever emotional role you played becomes more defined when it is missing. And the more grounded you are in your own life, the more that missing space feels intentional, not desperate. It feels like a man who did not collapse, who did not beg, who did not fall apart. It feels like strength, not loss. That is what makes the absence heavy. It is not empty. It is full of meaning. Meaning is what the emotional system responds to. Your silence, when paired with forward movement, communicates that you are not stuck. You are not frozen in the past. You are not waiting. You are living. And that creates emotional contrast between her static emotional memory and your dynamic present. This is where the mind begins to wonder, not "Is he gone?" but "What have I lost?" The question shifts from closure to evaluation. Evaluation brings value back into focus. And when value is felt in absence, it often feels stronger than when it was experienced in presence, because the mind is now free to magnify it. Absence removes the ordinary and leaves the emotional essence. That essence becomes heavy, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, lingering way. A weight in the background of thought, a subtle pull of memory, a sense of something unresolved. This is when the emotional gravity begins to form. Not because you tried to create it, but because your absence revealed what your presence meant. And when what you meant becomes clearer in silence than it ever was in closeness, the emotional door begins to reopen. That is when absence becomes louder than words, when emotional curiosity and the weight of your absence begin to build inside her. It naturally creates a tension that looks for release. The mind does not like unresolved emotional loops. It wants confirmation, reassurance, or at least a signal that the story is truly over. But instead of direct communication, what often appears first are tests, not bold declarations, not clear confessions, but subtle movements at the edge of contact. These are emotional probes. They are not about starting a conversation. They are about checking your emotional availability without risking vulnerability. A like on an old photo, a reaction to a story, a hoo-hoo appearance in a familiar place, a short, casual message that means nothing on the surface. "Hey, how have you been? Just saw something that reminded me of you." These are not random. They are temperature checks. She is not asking what you say. She is feeling how you feel. Is there warmth? Is there longing? Is there resentment? Is there still emotional openness? Because before a woman reopens emotionally, she wants to know if the emotional door is still unlocked, not intellectually, energetically. The test is not about the words. It is about your state. If your response carries urgency, relief, excitement, or emotional leaning, it confirms that the power dynamic has not changed. It tells her that you are still there, still waiting, still emotionally centered on her. But when your response is calm, grounded, present, and unreactive, something very different is felt. Not cold, not distant, not arrogant, simply stable. That stability creates a moment of recalibration in her nervous system, because the energy she expected is not there. She expected emotion. She expected reaction. She expected availability. But what she feels instead is composure. And composure communicates that your life is full, your center is intact, and your emotional world is no longer orbiting her. This is when the testing deepens. One small probe is followed by another. More engagement, more presence, more subtle attempts to feel your emotional temperature. This is not manipulation, it is instinct. The emotional system is trying to determine, is he still the same man I left, or has something shifted? And the more you remain calm, respectful, and non-attached, the more that shift becomes undeniable. She begins to feel a different polarity, not the polarity of pursuit, but the polarity of grounded presence. This is what reopens emotional attraction, because attraction is not created by words. It is created by state. Your state is what she is testing. Are you still reactive? Are you still seeking reassurance? Are you still emotionally leaning? Or are you centered, self-directed, and whole? Each test is an invitation, but not to chase. It is an invitation to remain who you have become. And when you do not rush in emotionally, when you do not try to fix, reconnect, or reclaim, the dynamic continues to shift. Now she is not just curious. She is feeling the space, feeling the change, feeling the difference between who you were and who you are now. This is when emotional safety begins to return. Not the safety of certainty, but the safety of stability. A man who does not collapse under contact, a man who does not cling to attention, a man who does not lose his center. That energy is deeply regulating to the nervous system. It says, this man is not driven by fear. He is not driven by lack. He is grounded. And grounded energy is what allows vulnerability to surface again, because vulnerability requires safety. And safety comes from stability, not pursuit. The tests continue until she feels that your emotional door is not wide open, but it is also not slammed shut. It is simply neutral. That neutrality is powerful. It means you are not holding on. It means you are not pushing away. It means you are present without attachment. And presence without attachment is magnetic. It creates emotional curiosity, emotional respect, and emotional tension all at once. She begins to feel the weight of what it would mean to lose you permanently, not as a concept, but as a felt reality. Because now you are not reaching, you are not pulling, you are simply standing. Standing in your life, standing in your growth, standing in your direction. And when a woman tests the emotional door and feels that you are no longer waiting behind it, something shifts inside her. The possibility of losing you becomes real. And when that possibility becomes real, the emotional system responds, not with logic, with feeling. This is the stage where silence, absence, and calm presence converge into emotional gravity. Not because you tried to create it, but because you stopped trying to control it. And in that letting go, the emotional door no longer belongs to the past. It becomes a doorway to something new. When you stop chasing, stop waiting, and stop emotionally leaning toward an outcome, something subtle but powerful begins to happen beneath the surface of the dynamic. Power is not a loud thing. It does not announce itself, it is felt. And it is felt most clearly when one person becomes internally stable while the other is still emotionally processing. At first, she may have felt in control because she was the one who pulled away or created distance. Control often comes from knowing the other person still wants you, still thinks about you, still hopes. That knowledge creates a sense of emotional leverage. Even in silence, she could feel that the cord was still there. But when your emotional attachment dissolves, when your focus shifts back to your own life, your own direction, your own sense of purpose, that invisible cord begins to loosen. And as it loosens, the entire balance of the interaction changes. You are no longer oriented around her reactions. You are no longer scanning for signs. You are no longer waiting for movement. You are moving. This is where the power dynamic quietly flips, because power in emotional relationships is not about who cares less. It is about who is more centered. The person who is most grounded in themselves is the person who is least controlled by the situation. And the one who is least controlled is the one whose presence, or absence, carries the most weight. When you are detached in a healthy way, your energy is no longer reaching outward. It is contained, it is settled, it is focused. This creates a feeling of completeness that can be sensed even without words. And that completeness changes how you are perceived. Not as someone who needs to be reassured, not as someone who needs closure, not as someone who needs validation, but as someone who is whole. Wholeness creates polarity. Polarity is what draws attention, curiosity, and emotional tension. It is the difference between two states, one person still processing, the other already grounded, one still circling the past, the other fully present in the now. This contrast is felt energetically. She begins to sense that you are no longer emotionally below the situation. You are not seeking resolution from her. You are not trying to repair or reclaim. You are simply living. And this living is not performative. It is not posted for reaction. It is not designed to send a message. It is internal. It is a shift in where your identity is anchored. Your identity is no longer the man who lost. It is the man who is moving forward. That shift is powerful, because now instead of her being the emotional reference point, you become your own reference point. You are no longer oriented toward her choices. You are oriented toward your own direction. This is what creates the feeling of rising value, not in an ego sense, in a stability sense. Stability is attractive because it signals emotional safety and strength at the same time. It says, this man is not shaken. He is not reactive. He is not collapsed. He is steady. Steadiness creates trust, even in silence. And when trust begins to form again, even unconsciously, the emotional system becomes curious. It begins to reassess. It begins to wonder if the initial judgment, the initial decision, the initial story was complete. Because now the emotional environment has changed. The man who once leaned is now centered. The man who once waited is now moving. The man who once sought is now present. This shift removes pressure from the dynamic and replaces it with space. And in that space, her own feelings become louder. She is no longer reacting to your pursuit. She is reacting to your absence. But not an empty absence. A grounded absence. Grounded absence carries weight because it communicates that you are not frozen in the past. You are not stuck in longing. You are not emotionally bargaining with reality. You have accepted. And acceptance is power. Because acceptance means you are no longer trying to control the outcome. You are allowing life to move. And when life moves through you instead of against you, your energy becomes calm, open, and strong at the same time. That calm strength shifts how you are held in her emotional memory, not as a man who was trying to hold on, but as a man who stood. And when a man stands in himself, he becomes a point of reference, not a point of need. That is when the dynamic changes. Not because you demanded it, not because you argued, not because you explained, but because you became centered. And a centered man always changes the emotional field around him, even in silence. That is how detachment quietly turns into influence. And that is when the balance begins to tilt back in your favor. When the noise of communication stops and the space between you grows quiet, something very specific begins to happen inside her emotional world. The mind, no longer distracted by new input, starts to replay what is stored. And what is stored is not the last argument, not the last misunderstanding, not the final cold moment. What rises first are the emotional imprints, the feeling of connection, the sense of being understood, the memory of how you made her feel when things were good. The human mind is wired to remember emotionally charged moments more strongly than logical ones. And when you are no longer present to create new experiences, the emotional memory takes over. It fills the silence. It becomes the soundtrack of the quiet. This is when the version of you she lost becomes more vivid than the version she left. She begins to remember your tone, your presence, your energy, the way you showed up when things mattered. She remembers the stability, the laughter, the protection, the way your attention felt when it was fully there. These memories do not appear as a deliberate choice. They surface naturally, especially during moments of emotional vulnerability late at night or when something in her current life does not give her the same feeling. Comparison begins silently, not a conscious checklist, not a rational contrast. How did I feel with him? How do I feel now? What is missing? What was familiar that I no longer have? And in that comparison, the emotional weight of who you were starts to grow. Your absence removes the friction of the ending. The mind is no longer focused on the conflict. It is focused on the connection. The nervous system remembers how it felt to be emotionally regulated in your presence, how your energy anchored certain moments, how your attention created a sense of safety or excitement. This is where nostalgia forms. Not fantasy, emotional recall. And emotional recall is powerful because it brings feeling back into the body. It is not just a thought, it is a sensation, a warmth, a heaviness, a subtle ache. She starts to feel the difference between the emotional world she had with you and the one she is in now. And if your current silence is calm, non-reactive, and grounded, the memory of you is not associated with chaos or desperation. It is associated with stability and depth. That makes the emotional replay even stronger. Now the mind begins to soften the edges of the past. The mistakes fade into the background. The emotional moments come forward. The way you once made her feel seen, desired, understood, or supported becomes the dominant memory. This is not idealization. This is emotional imprint. Imprints do not disappear easily, and when the present does not provide the same emotional resonance, the past becomes louder. This is when regret can begin to form. Not regret in the sense of, I made a mistake, but regret in the sense of something meaningful is gone. That feeling is subtle at first, a quiet heaviness, a sense of loss that does not have a clear shape yet. But it grows when the mind continues to replay the emotional version of you that once existed in her life. She begins to wonder if that version of you is still there. Not in a hopeful way, in a curious way. Is he still that man? Has he changed? Did I misread his value? Did I let something solid go? These questions arise not because you pushed them into her mind, but because your absence created space for them to surface. And the more you remain emotionally composed, the more the memory of you stabilizes as something positive and strong, rather than something chaotic or needy. Your silence, when it is not reactive, allows your best emotional version to be what remains. Not your fear, not your pain, not your confusion, your grounded presence. This is what makes the emotional replay powerful, because now in her inner world, you are not associated with pressure, you are associated with depth. Depth creates longing, not desperation, but emotional gravity. She begins to feel that what she lost was not just a relationship, but a certain feeling of being with a man who was emotionally solid and present. And when that feeling is no longer available in her current reality, the memory becomes more valuable. Value is often recognized most clearly in absence. Not because absence is a tactic, but because absence removes distraction. And in that clarity, the emotional imprint of who you were begins to speak for itself. Quietly, persistently, without you saying a word. That is when the past stops being closed. It becomes emotionally alive again. And when emotional memory becomes alive, the door is no longer fully shut. There comes a moment when the internal shift is complete. Not the moment when you decide to move on, but the moment when your nervous system finally releases the attachment. When you no longer check your phone with anticipation, when her name no longer triggers a spike of emotion, when the past no longer pulls your attention back into old conversations and imagined futures. This is the moment you stop waiting, not because you are trying to appear strong, but because you truly are. At this stage, your life begins to move forward in a way that is no longer oriented around what might happen with her. Your focus returns to your body, your work, your discipline, your direction. You start waking up with purpose instead of memory. You start building instead of replaying. You start investing energy in growth instead of outcome. This is not forced detachment. This is natural realignment. Your identity shifts from the man who lost something to the man who is becoming something. And when that shift happens, your emotional gravity changes. You are no longer anchored to the past. You are anchored to movement. Movement creates momentum. Momentum creates confidence. Confidence creates presence. Presence is felt even in silence. When you are no longer waiting, your energy is no longer reaching backward, it is facing forward. And forward-facing energy has a very different emotional signature than longing energy. Longing is tight. It is focused on absence. It is heavy with hope. Forward energy is open. It is calm. It is grounded in what is. This grounded movement is what creates the strongest emotional contrast for her. Because now, instead of sensing someone who is emotionally paused, she senses someone who is in motion. Someone whose life is unfolding. someone who is not orbiting her decisions. That shift is felt as independence. Independence is not coldness, it is self-sufficiency. And self-sufficiency is deeply attractive because it signals that your emotional stability does not depend on external validation. It says, I am okay within myself. When you are no longer waiting, you no longer need reassurance. You no longer need closure. You no longer need to be chosen again to feel complete. You have already chosen yourself. This creates a powerful reversal. Before, the emotional focus was on whether she would come back. Now, the emotional focus is on your life. And when your life becomes the center, you become the reference point. She begins to sense that the window is no longer open indefinitely. Not because you closed it with bitterness, but because you walked through it and continued on. This creates a subtle urgency in the emotional system. Not panic, not fear, but awareness. Awareness that you are no longer suspended in the past. Awareness that time is moving. Awareness that you are becoming someone who may not be accessible in the same way again. And that awareness can awaken feelings that were dormant. Not because you tried to provoke them, but because your movement made the loss real. When you were emotionally waiting, the story felt unfinished. There was still a sense that things were on hold. When you move on internally, the story gains weight, it gains finality, it gains reality, and reality is what the emotional system responds to. She begins to feel the difference between a man who is emotionally paused and a man who is progressing. Progression creates value because it shows direction, stability, and growth. Growth is attractive because it signals future, not fantasy future, real future. A future that is not centered on her but on your own evolution. This is when the dynamic reaches its turning point. Not because she suddenly decides something, but because she feels something. She feels that the man she once knew is no longer standing in the same place emotionally. She feels that he has moved beyond the moment where her choice defined his state. She feels that his life is expanding in a way that does not require her participation, and that can awaken reflection. Reflection leads to reassessment. Reassessment leads to emotional reopening, not as a guarantee, not as a strategy, but as a natural consequence of your internal shift. The moment you stop waiting is the moment you stop emitting lack. And when lack dissolves, what remains is presence. Presence without need is powerful. It says, I am here, I am whole, I am moving. And whether paths cross again or not, this state is victory. Because now your peace is no longer dependent on return. Your confidence is no longer dependent on validation. Your future is no longer dependent on the past. You are no longer holding space for what was. You are creating space for what is becoming. And that is when everything changes.